Okay, we'll get things started. I'll start with our intros. So welcome everyone. Welcome to Balance's webinar today entitled Competing Against Eating Disorders, Clinical Themes in the Treatment of Athletes. I'm incredibly excited to be hosting and moderating today's webinar with Dr. Riley Nickols joining us. Feel very, very honoured, Riley. So thanks for taking the time today. I'm going to start with a little bit of an introduction about myself and Balance Eating Disorder Treatment Centre here in the city. And then we'll go over some housekeeping, and then I'd love to introduce you to Dr. Nickols, and then Riley, you'll take it away. So a little bit about Balance. My name is Melainie Rogers. I'm the founder and CEO here at Balance Eating Disorder Treatment Centre. We're right here in the heart of New York City. We are an outpatient treatment centre that right now is fully virtual. Actually, we have been for the last year. We offer all levels of outpatient care to teens and adults of all genders. As I mentioned, right now, all of our programming is virtual. We are hoping in the summer that we'll be back in person, but we'll continue to offer some virtual services on a more permanent basis, even once we're able to get back in person. At Balance, we do work with athletes and performing artists, and the demands of performance on our professional level athletes and artists present really unique challenges when we're treating eating disorders. There are demands often on a certain weight that our athletes and particularly dancers are expected to be at, yet we're trying to balance that with the recovery of an eating disorder. So this topic is a very, very important topic for us in the field to learn more about. How do you navigate that very delicate pathway? And so incredibly excited to have Riley with us. Another reason that this topic is really essential, and Riley and I were speaking about this, is that for the longest time in the eating disorder field, exercise as a part of recovery was actually considered mutually exclusive. By that I mean that if you went into eating disorder recovery or treatment, it was expected and encouraged that you stop basically all exercise and activity. And throughout the decades, fortunately, we have more research now to provide a more fuller picture of what can be helpful and what is harmful, but also how do we navigate that in a way that can allow particularly our athletes especially to be able to continue to maintain some of their fitness and performance while still simultaneously going through recovery. So incredibly important topic. Some housekeeping for you all. Today's event is a webinar with slide presentation. So all of our audience therefore will be muted, but we do ask you or encourage you to ask questions. And for those who are familiar, if you go down to the bottom of your screen, there's a chat box. There's also a Q&A box, and you can pop questions in there as they come up for you as Riley goes through his presentation. I, as the moderator, will then be checking for any questions that come up, and as relevant, I'll be asking Riley those questions, relaying those questions to Riley throughout his presentation, and we'll also have time at the end of today's presentation for any further questions as well. So please go ahead and pop your questions in the chat box or the Q&A. Today's event is also being recorded, and we'll be following up by sending everyone who's joining us today and registered with an email with a link to today's webinar. It will also be on our Balance YouTube channel, so you can check it out there. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our presenter. Dr. Riley Nickols is a counselling and sports psychologist who specialises in treating athletes with eating disorders. He's the director of the Victory Program, which is the nation's only residential treatment facility for athletes in the country. That's at McCallum Place in St. Louis, Missouri. Dr. Nickols holds a master's degrees in both sports psychology and counselling psychology, and a PhD in counselling psychology. He's a certified eating disorder specialist through the International Association of Eating Disorder Professionals, otherwise known as IDAP, and is certified in the integrated treatment of eating disorders from the Contemporary Psychotherapies Centre for the Study of Anorexia and Bulimia, otherwise known as CSAB. Dr. Nickols is a member of the Association of Applied Sports Psychology's Eating Disorders Special Interest Group. Riley works with athletes, coaches, and sports medicine personnel about disordered eating and consults with eating disorder professionals on best practices for integrating exercise during eating disorder treatment. He maintains a private practice in St. Louis, where he primarily works with athletes addressing both clinical and performance concerns. In addition to competing in endurance sports for over 15 years, Dr. Nickols is a running coach and a USA triathlon coach. Riley, I do not know where you get the time, but we're thrilled to have you today. And without further ado, I would love to turn it over to you, Riley.
Okay, thanks so much, Melainie, for that intro and just for having me, and Leslie and Balance. I certainly honored at the opportunity, and always am excited when there is an interest in just learning more about this unique subset just within the eating disorder sector with athletes. Feel privileged to be in this space and working with this clientele. I think that a lot of us can attest to and agree to, but also feel a sense of duty to try and pass along and share some of the rich knowledge and experiences that we're having on a day-to-day basis in the intensive treatment world, residential, partial hospitalization and IOP at McCallum Place, and then also I see it in the outpatient world too. My hope, and anytime giving a talk when you're talking about a population, is really hoping not to generalize across the board, because obviously there's such nuances and unique cases, situations, and dispositions, and so my hope is not to trivialize or oversimplify athlete population, but I certainly, for the sake of time, will kind of give just my thoughts on that and experiences as well. Happy to answer any questions along the way. And so with that, I'll go ahead and off we go, if that's all right, Melainie.
Right, go ahead. I'm going to turn off my camera, so over to you.
Okay. So I think just to kind of frame things, I know this is kind of somewhat, I think everyone on the call at some level recognizes why treatment is needed, just with this population, of course, with eating disorders. I think athletes, there's a lot of overlap, but also a lot of just unique kind of nuances too. And I think in the sport world, and when I say athletes, it includes dancers, artists as well, kind of, and more traditional kind of athletes in sport. So, but athletes, as we know, I think treatment is needed. But however, I do think that, of course, without treatment, psychologically, medically, and otherwise, things can really deteriorate, as we know. And at some point along the line, certainly not immediately, sport performance decrements will occur. And of course, with those decrements, that comes some other stressors, of course, and pressure. And so disorder can function in that capacity too. It's not exactly a cyclical nature in this regard, but this is fairly common for the most part for what we sometimes see. As many of us can attest, it takes a village, and coordinating care appropriately within the multidisciplinary framework that we all operate from is a Herculean effort, to say the least, but just so essential and vital to provide comprehensive care to individuals that we are entrusted to care for in this space. So of course we're well adapted. There's the licensed mental health provider, dietitian, family therapist, psychiatrist, family parents. The athletes are, just another additional players are kind of oftentimes needed to be included at some capacity in the care of athletes with eating disorders. Sport physician, athletic trainer, physical therapist, strength and conditioning coach, of course, coaches, coaching staff, and then sometimes athletic administration. And this is more oftentimes for collegiate athletes, or sometimes Olympic athletes, and sometimes professional athletes as well. So there's another layer here too, and as we can easily see, the communication disruptions amongst everyone can be pretty easy to happen, and so it just poses some challenges. But I think if you're working with an athlete I think just being sensitive and recognizing the key players in the sport world and their sport family, which a lot of athletes spend equal, if not far more time with their sport family than their family of origin. And I think including them in their care at some level is really vital. When I speak at colleges, I hate to kind of lead with the R word, with risk, but there is a tremendous risk associated with mismanaging an athlete's care. And as I become accustomed to, most college institutions are risk aversive and want to minimize risk, amongst other things. Yes, of course, care for their student athletes. This is a kind of an older article, but it talks about the legal duty of a college athletic department to appropriately care for athletes with eating disorders. And I think this oftentimes can sometimes get administration's attention in terms of giving the effort, the resources appropriately devoted to, and I can share this article if need be too. So I think in working, and I'll start, and I recognize that there are athletes at all skill levels. Adolescent, of course, has its own unique challenges. Collegiate athletes are probably the majority just demographically of what we see in the Victory program, though we do have a pretty robust adolescent athlete population. And then in my outpatient practice too, I've come to learn that there are some limitations just in terms of working with college athletes, even athletes at Division I schools, and Division I schools are oftentimes flush with resources. However, they oftentimes woefully lack, unfortunately, adequate number of licensed mental health providers, registered dietitians, and whatnot too, to provide adequate oversight, obviously, to the number of athletes. Some of these schools have 400, 500 athletes. And so they oftentimes operate from somewhat of a frequent, a brief model, 10 to 12 sessions, just due to the demand of services in the counseling department, or even in the athletic department with sports psychologists. Sometimes there's limited opportunity for providers in-house to kind of have more long-term cases, but there's just a brief model. And of course, with eating disorders, more long-term care oftentimes needed. So that poses some challenges too. Given how stretched I think sport personnel are, there's just challenges just inherently with being able to provide kind of more comprehensive oversight to adequately support these athletes as well. Some schools do have providers on staff that do have really sound eating disorder expertise, but oftentimes that's a limitation too. So just having somebody with that training and expertise too is sometimes quite a challenge. Also, the communication piece we talked about. Screening's a challenge. I don't know if many of you are familiar with PPEs, but these are the pre-performance examinations that most all college athletes undergo, and they're screening for a host of physical, psychological ailments, issues to kind of just be sensitive to and mindful of, and there's a lot of things to screen for, and I think they do the best they can to kind of obviously screen for disordered eating. As we know, there's some nice measurements out there that are valid, reliable, but I think the measurements are essentially worthless and useless if there's not accurate self-report. Athletes are pretty smart and recognize oftentimes that their responses will raise some flags too. So I do think colleges do the best they can to screen, but obviously that's under the assumption that there's accurate reporting, and even at that, some athletes inadvertently can fall through the cracks too. The lack of motivation and ambivalence is something we're all acutely aware of. I do think there's oftentimes consult with a lot of providers, but sport personnel too, and the comment I oftentimes hear from them is, they just don't want to go to a higher level of care. And I try to normalize that and say, yeah, it'd be really strange if they were really motivated and excited for that. That's normal, but kind of to empower sport personnel to leverage and flex appropriately with their ability to essentially facilitate a higher level of care if and when needed, and actually mandate that if a student athlete desires to continue participation with their organization or college. The part of treatment, I think, too, is really addressing kind of a multitude of aspects, of course. Yes, there's just the fundamental helping individuals reshape their relationship with food and nutrition, absolutely. Oftentimes reshaping relationship with their bodies, of course. But also too, like their sport. And I think it's important as a provider to really get a good sense and understand what the relationship to sport is. And sometimes there can be false assumptions that I've been guilty of kind of making in terms of just assuming that an athlete is participating in their sport for certain reasons, such as the genuine love of their sport. And I think oftentimes, and this isn't always the case, but sometimes find that, maybe what started out initially, maybe even in childhood with engagement in sport as just pure fun and enjoyment, has turned into a sense of obligation. Or this is something that my parents, is a sport my parents played, so I feel kind of like indebted to them for what they've sacrificed and the resources they poured into my sport training. Or scholarship or livelihood, even professionally, is inherent, and so that can really alter and change and shift kind of one's relationship to sport. But I do think trying to really examine that, and oftentimes that needs some mending also. And most of the time, and again, this is I hate to use just broad sweeping generalizations, but most of the athletes that I see currently coming into treatment at any level, intensive treatment or outpatient, oftentimes describe their relationship with sport as being just like unenjoyable, not stimulating. It hasn't been enjoyable for a while. It seemed pretty monotonous, and that's pretty understandable. But I think as a provider, really recognizing that and trying to take efforts to try to heal and mend that relationship with sport, if need be. I think I'd be remiss to skip this these next couple slides for a talk on athletes and eating disorders. Again, this is going to be redundant for many of you tuning in, so I'm not going to stand here long. But RED-S or relative energy deficiency in sport is I think relevant for working with athletes. Kind of resonates a little bit more. So in trying to explain and I think speak to some of the implications just in terms of systems of the body that of course are impacted from an eating disorder or just a notable energy deficiency. Much more comprehensive, as we know, than the female athlete triad, and inclusive of males and postmenopausal women also. So oftentimes when talk about this in groups or sessions, and it doesn't really land or stick for most athletes in terms of, if you have objective data to support systems of the body that are quite compromised, whether that's a lab panel, bone health, cardiovascular functioning, psychological functioning, that's fine. Oftentimes, there's I think this slide too sometimes gets athletes' attention more so, and they can identify actually with aspects and byproducts of being in a state of energy deficiency or malnourishment or kind of dysregulated eating exercise patterns. But most athletes can identify with, wow, I have experienced kind of a decreased training response. And if I'm honest, kind of the last half of my workouts, it's hard for me to sustain a consistent intensity or even just focus or concentration even. And so not all athletes that we work with, but most athletes, performance is important. And so I think sometimes you have to use that verbiage and weave it in with the other aspects in which you're, of course, working, and the lens in which you work from. But I found this is useful, especially for coaches too. You need to kind of speak performance endlessly, because most athletes are attempting to, of course, perform at a high level consistently for a long, sustained duration of time. And obviously, when some of these things are occurring, it is really readily to see, maybe not immediately, but at some point performance will be impacted. And I think that's important to keep in mind also. One of the things that I will say with this also is that I think it's important as a provider, and I'm struck each and every day at just how tremendously resilient the human brain and body are. It's fascinating to me to see how at such a high level an individual can perform academically, vocationally, athletically, really being compromised. And in a really unwholesome state, medically, psychologically too. So I just think it's important, especially in the context of sport, if performance isn't suffering, if there's not performance decrements, if an athlete isn't in this vicious vortex of injuries, right? That doesn't also imply that an athlete is the picture of health and wellness. I'm guilty of that, of kind of just assuming, well, this athlete's performing at a pretty high level, they must be taking good care of themselves in the picture of health and wellness. And absolutely, sometimes that is true. But I think in the sport world, There can be a lack of urgency from well-meaning, well-intentioned providers, coaches, even treatment team members when performance decrements are not occurring. We in fact have seen several athletes performing at the top level nationally and kind of limp into treatment in the midst of all that also. I also think part of treatment in general and just in thinking about things is just like examining one's relationship with food, with body, relationship to training and in sport is really important. So exercise / training essentially for this sake. And as we all know, that's highly impactful. I think compulsive exercise, unbalanced exercise is a prominent feature of eating disorders. Kind of just another layer here in working with athletic population, and is oftentimes athletes are praised and rewarded or recognized for working really hard, getting in extra workouts. Coaches love those athletes, and as you might imagine, these kind of unwholesome, unbalanced behavior specifically to training or exercise can inadvertently, unintentionally really be reinforced by peers, by teammates, by coaching staff too. And so you can see it can really just be reinforced inadvertently also. However, I do think obviously this is kind of oftentimes muddies the waters for everyone to kind of really identify like what is kind of unbalanced and unwholesome and what is kind of more normative in terms of the context of sport too. And so this can be quite challenging as well. And there is a kind of fundamental belief, I'm kind of of this mindset also, that compulsive exercise in of itself does not exist. I do think it is oftentimes a byproduct of an eating disorder in the sport sector, poses some significant challenges, of course, to tease out also. One of the, I think this is almost like a daily conversation that I have with athletes, I have with parents of athletes, and sometimes even physicians of athletes is this notion of my heart rate is low because I'm an athlete or because I'm in shape. And I recognize that. I think that is just a myth. I think probably we all at some level hear oftentimes, and I think this is something too that unintentionally can be just missed or dismissed to somebody's athletic prowess or their involvement in sport. But there is a distinct difference between an athlete heart and a sick heart. And Dr. Jen Gaudiani talks wonderfully about this also. And there are certain ways to kind of, objectively measure what constitutes an athlete's heart or sick heart. This is a study that shows, and our doctors and physicians at McCallum Place also subscribe to this notion that really it is quite actually rare for an athlete's resting heart rate to fall below 50 beats a minute. And I oftentimes think, though, that like if an athlete's heart is in fact resting heart rate below 50 and they are in a state of energy balance, right, that's okay, or that's not as problematic. But the big caveat is in a state of energy balance. Most of the athletes that we work with and see are in a pretty notable state of energy deficiency. And so I think it's essentially providing rationale and education as to why that is. Your body literally does not have enough available energy to sustain a heart rate that is normal. And so it's trying to conserve and slow down heart rate because there's not enough available energy. I believe Dr. Gaudiani calls it the get up and go test. We've done this too at McCallum Place, where it's a simple test in terms of seated to standing. Pretty simple task, right? And from seated, take resting heart rate, stand, walk across the room, and come back. And I think I can't remember, I'll double check this because it's leaving my mind at the moment. But I believe if heart rate jumps, I think if it's over 25 or 30 beats after walking, that is a more support for a sick heart. Obviously, orthostatic pulse changes too from seated to standing. 20 or greater is oftentimes too just indicative of a sick heart. Also, very simple task. You can see we have a triathlete in our care right now, and she said, I just raced the weekend before I admitted to residential treatment, didn't find anything wrong, and I was shocked to see how bradycardic I was. I didn't know I was orthostatic. And I think, like a lot of things, if we're not if our patients are not measuring these metrics, right, with blood pressure, heart rate, and other things, they're obviously not going to be aware, of what's going on. So this is kind of a myth you'll kind of constantly have to address. And even very well accomplished, knowledgeable physicians and cardiologists, I can't tell you how many athletes come to our care after seeing a physician, cardiologist, having a stress test done, having an echo, and they're severely bradycardic. And the response that they get from their medical provider is, well, you're a cyclist. That's, it's not, I'm not super concerned. I think I read a study where our doctors kind of have mentioned that I think the average amount of time in medical school that med students get training specifically with eating disorders, I believe, is either 14 to 16 minutes, right? So I think very well-intentioned, well-meaning providers, but again, not having the specialized sensitivity and nuancedness of some of these implications of being in a state of energy deficiency are really problematic, and can really send mixed messages, and can ultimately delay an individual to get the care support that is just desperately needed.
So true, Riley. Riley, there is a question that just came in. I'm not sure if you want to take it now or later. I'll read it out to you, and then you let me know. This is from Sadie. Sadie says, I'm trying to help a 15-year-old boy who struggles with compulsive exercise and restriction get residential treatment, but there seems to be an 8+ week wait for programs all over the country. Yeah, we're seeing that too, Sadie. So Sadie's question is, what do you recommend the outpatient treatment team do in the meantime while clients are waiting for higher levels of care? Is that something you want to answer now or take that later?
I'm happy to. This is an unfortunate reality of the world I think we're all collectively living in, with intensive treatment centers across the country, just with the demand and just the lack of availability to kind of get people in a timely, quick manner. So it poses challenges on many fronts. The treatment team, it's obviously very risky and scary for the patients and families. My recommendation would be, and I'm sure if your client is 15 years old, the parents are involved at some capacity, but I really think really building out their involvement and oversight in pretty much all aspects of care to kind of almost like bridge that gap. Just given they're likely at home, some primary caregivers at home with adolescents most of the time. But I do think we've seen some parents have to do some pretty drastic things to support their child, even if that's sleeping in the same room as them at night, and opting for the virtual schooling because they can see and kind of oversee the plating and eating of meals, as opposed to in-person schooling, if that's an option. And of course, kind of building out the support from an outpatient provider standpoint, increasing frequency of visits, a therapist, dietitian, and even a medical doctor for labs and vitals. It's a tough situation. I don't mean to oversimplify it. It's not ideal, but really, given the circumstances and the wait time, that's about all that's needed. And when someone is compromised in that capacity and they need residential care, they can deteriorate quickly. And so I do think that medical follow-up regularly is just really needed, because even just medical stabilization is sometimes warranted. And we've seen that for a lot of our adolescents. And it's heartbreaking because we have a dancer in our care right now. She's 15 from Northern California. And unfortunately, she would be go inpatient to medically stabilize. There was no availability from residential treatment centers to do a direct transfer, which is ideal. And so she would just go back home to outpatient, right? And so would kind of deteriorate pretty quickly thereafter. So there was this cycle of stabilizing medically, inpatient, and then outpatient, stabilizing, and then she's finally in our care now. And it's just really heartbreaking and quite sad. But that's not a wonderful solution, but just kind of, I guess, my initial thoughts to that.
Absolutely, Riley, and we're doing the same thing to Sadie's question. We're trying to bolster and just hold the client in an outpatient setting, hoping that we can prevent further deterioration, not expecting that we can help them improve because it's an inadequate level of care and they're really struggling. But if we can prevent or slow down further deterioration, that's the goal until we can get them into res. But it's a very, very disturbing phenomena that we're seeing right now as a a byproduct, or not a byproduct, a direct product of COVID. Riley, there's a question here that just came in, if it feels timely. How is compulsive exercise defined?
That's a wonderful, very timely question for the next slide, Melainie. So I'll kind of move to that, but that's a wonderful question.
Terrific.
Good friend and colleague, Kate Bennett, she's also a sports psychologist specializing in eating disorders, kind of a really wonderfully illustrated kind of the contrasting between more wholesome exercise and more exercise pathology, right? And you can kind of find it as more, compulsive exercise. But you see the contrast there too. Oftentimes there is this notion whereby, the flexibility is essentially kind of non-existent with with more exercise pathology or kind of compulsive exercise. A lot of rigidity. It's okay to have a preference, and that's, I think, what I kind of reflect to a lot of athletes. I say, look, it's completely understandable that you have a preference to kind of get in your workout today as planned. That's no problem. But that's, I think of it as kind of holding it more open-handed. In nation where you have a preference, but where we see things be compulsive and more kind of exercise pathology, where it's more closed-fisted and it's an absolute. And I must do this, and I must get it in as planned, or else, to feel productive, to feel like I've utilized my time appropriately, to justify my eating, and it's an absolute. And so you can see the rigidity there is just inherent. And when a workout is missed, in a more wholesome relationship, it causes, a little bit of concern. But when there's compulsive, unbalanced exercise, it causes utter distress, and it's quite intolerable, right? Which that reaction almost like ratchets up the rigidity too of and the compulsivity of the exercise. So it's really challenging. Oftentimes too, I find that compulsive exercise really dismisses and disregards science completely. And if you think about it, I'm curious. I'm always just like really curious about, so where's the end goal here? Like, and oftentimes there's not. It kind of like resets daily. There's no, oftentimes no clear pathway or goal. It's like sweat equity, and it's kind of moving to burn energy, to burn calories, whatever it might be. And there really is, it's not scientifically based or rooted. And when working with athletes, there is a mountain of scientific literature, exercise physiology literature about the body's physiological system and adapting to stressors, right? Coaches get paid a lot of money, and their livelihood depends on preparing athletes optimally to perform. I coach athletes and triathletes, have for a while. And my goal is to periodize training so that athletes are peaking for races during the year at precise times. And so training needs to be structured as such, where there's a period where it's like more base, and then more building. And then obviously, you're peaking for a very finite period of time, and then you need to rest and taper before you kind of can move through that periodization cycle again. And you can only do that a few times during the year, really. But oftentimes individuals who are struggling with more unwholesome, unbalanced exercise and compulsive exercise really dismiss science, right? And it's kind of, for lack of a better word, I'm the special snowflake who doesn't need rest days. I feel fine, I'm never tired. And that kind of really obviously conveniently upholds and justifies their excessive movements. I also say when working with athletes, I say, okay, your coach has laid out this beautiful training plan for you. If you are doing one additional workout this week, or extending a workout's duration, or exceeding the intensity parameters of a given workout, your training is no longer periodized. It's no longer periodized. And so you're going rogue and essentially creating and adopting and adhering to your own training regime and training program that is no longer scientifically based, that's no longer rooted in science, and just a nice, is no longer nutritionally supported by your meal plan. Because guess what? Your meal plan is built for a certain amount of output, obviously, too. So there's so many layers here, but I do think in terms of like the resourcefulness, the openness, the curiosity is often shut down. There's oftentimes a lack of variety for individuals who are struggling with compulsive exercise. And that's something you see too. Doing very monotonous, mundane, whether that's distance, types of workouts, there's just not a lot of variety too. And of course, training through illness and injury. The question that I always think of in terms of orienting and asking, I asked this in a group the other day that I was facilitating, is, do you structure your life around your exercise and training, or do you structure your training and exercise around your life? It's an important question, and it'll kind of like be indicative if an individual is honest about kind of the place that sits. And so, part of that is trying to reshape that to be more wholesome, of course, amongst other things too. But I like this kind of contrast also. So I could talk for hours on this. So I really apologize for kind of trivializing, but for the sake of time, I'm gonna probably blow through this really quickly. So I'll do the best I can. The biggest question kind of that or one of the most common questions that I hear from providers is, and sport personnel, is like, well, what does return to training look like? What factors are need to be considered? How should it be done? Which I think are beautiful questions. So I think just zooming out, I think of eating disorders as a severe metabolic injury. And I think when you're talking to athletes, when you're talking to coaches, sport personnel, well-versed in terms of physical injuries, I think utilizing that verbiage, a metabolic injury, resonates. Most athletes want to do what they can to avoid injury, to avoid reoccurrence of injury. And as we all know, returning to any type of exercise too prematurely or too aggressively after an injury really just increases the chance of re-injury. The same goes for eating disorders. Reintegrating them back into training, an athlete's training and or exercise, and or even their team prematurely really just heightens and increases an athlete's vulnerability to have a reemergence of these struggles. So I think thinking about it in terms of an injury is really So I think there's many things to consider here. Foundationally, of course, medical stability is vital. And if you, and this is challenging in the outpatient world, I recognize that, I'm sensitive, I experience this. Sometimes you feel like on an island, like I cross your fingers, I hope they're medically stable, but you darn well better know and be certain, because that is absolutely foundational. And again, you don't know if an individual is medically stable or not unless they're being evaluated on a somewhat regular basis. So I think mandating that in terms of being a precursor to integrating back into any type of physical exercise and training is just essential. Intensive treatment's lovely and beautiful because everything's contained. We get vitals, medical stability is evaluated on a daily basis. Outpatient, it's much more challenging, but needs to be done frequently. So of course, this is all contingent on medical stabilization. So willingness to fuel for output, that also is foundational. If there's not a willingness to nutritionally support your output, it's a no-brainer. It's not yet time. This makes no sense. So I also think there's a clinical piece too. So a psychological readiness piece is vital and paramount. And this might feel a bit more abstract and ambiguous, but it's highly, highly important. And I think we've all kind of sat with some clients that we're working with, and you just get this feeling, and it's almost like this pressuredness behind asking for, like, when can I start training? Can I increase it? And it's okay if those questions are asked, but there's almost like a pressuredness behind it and a forcefulness and or a perseveration kind of around that also. And that, I think, for me, in my experience, is a telltale sign that the brain still needs to heal a bit. We've learned a lot over the last 8 years or so that I've been at McCallum Place in the Victory program. And there have been a couple of cases where, a few cases where we've jumped the gun unintentionally so, and there's been other things going on that would clearly indicate that individual's not ready to integrate, exercise into treatment. we've integrated it, and we see if that's premature, it actually is like pouring gas on a fire, and it actually intensifies the perseverations, and it's really destructive. And so there is kind of this part art, part science piece to reintegrating training. And there's a clinical piece also, and a psychological readiness piece too, to being able to regulate emotions in other ways that do not involve movement. That seems really basic for a lot of the clients that we see, really challenging. But like a substance like alcohol, if there is no other way for you to feel productive, to focus, to concentrate, to feel like you have value, to feel accomplished, to sleep, other than exercise, right? That's problematic. It's okay if that is one of the ways, but I think cultivating other ways to self-regulate is vital. And if that's the only way, that's problematic, of course. And the supervision of response to training is key. Just like, an athletic trainer supervises an athlete coming back after an ACL tear, needs to be supervised. And that's the big wild card in terms of what the heck that looks like on outpatient level of care, and sometimes quite challenging to do. But you got to get creative. I think there are ways to supervise it with parents, right? Great feedback for adolescents. In terms of supervising their workouts, making sure someone always has eyes. There's a start and end time. There's check-ins, pre-post, whatnot too. I could talk a lot more about this, but the supervision piece is key, not just from a treatment team standpoint, but actually the nuts and bolts is who's overseeing this individual's return to exercise too. One of the other things that I'll also mention, in the lovely world that we live in, when technology is plentiful, it can be used for the good or for the evil. And I think this goes true with athletes. Athletes are oftentimes data driven most of the time with their performances and improvements, and this really is motivating to them. I think that I'm thinking of several athletes that I'm currently working with, and they train and wear GPS watches. Runners, cyclists, other athletes as well, right? They wear GPS watches, Garmin's, and whatnot too. And they're collecting data about their workouts and whatnot too. I'm a big believer that if an individual and a client in our care is collecting data, and this goes for non-athletes too. So I have several non-athletes on my caseload also. And if they're collecting data with like Apple Watch, right? And they're looking at data and they're logging data and they're tracking data, they absolutely need to share that with your treatment team, because withholding that from your treatment team just seems utterly colluding with kind of this unwholesome, secretive nature of exercise, of output. And so if you're tracking data in whatever capacity, it also needs to be shared. So there have been times it feels like Big Brother. I recognize that, but it also can be quite, these parameters can actually be protective. And I try and frame that too. Sometimes with individuals we work with, a really core value is autonomy and independence. And sometimes when there's parameters, even if that's sessions with treatment team members or parameters around nutrition or training, that can feel really stifling. But I think I view parameters as actually very protective than punitive. And I think actually the parameter of, hey, my team has my Garmin account and they're aware of my output is actually really needed and informative. Yes, individuals can take off their watch. I know that, and go and rip off a workout. But I had an athlete last week, actually, she's at college, and she's a runner. She's slowly reintegrating her training. And, objective measures, weight has been dropping, and she reports eating her meal plan. And I kind of asked her, how much walking are you doing? Because I know it's been a challenge for her in the past. And she said, oh, not a lot. I mean, I'm just kind of walking to the dorm, into the dining hall. And I said, okay, because this doesn't all add up here. I said, do you take your phone with you, where you go? She says, yeah, why? And I said, okay, would you mind? And again, I say this with very cautiously, because I know you have to be user discernment clinically if this is appropriate or not with client you're working with. But with an iPhone, there's obviously the health tracking app and the steps walked. It's not exacting, but it is data, right? And for this, it just wasn't adding up. And she kept reporting she wasn't walking much. Well, she pulled out her phone, and she had never actually opened this app because she's not really obsessive about kind of the steps and whatnot too. But it was actually quite eye-opening for both of us, because I had to go back the past week, and she was averaging about 22,000 steps a day, right? Kind of problematic and really not accounted for in her meal plan by any way, shape, or form. And this is in addition to her running that she's been doing. So it's clear, it kind of was surprising to her. But actually those objective measures using technology can be very informative from a treatment standpoint. And so I think just considering, especially with athletes who collect data, use data, need to capture data to provide to their coaches, I think this is a relevant piece. There's, again, just a nuance from maybe the non-athlete population. When I coached a running group in Central Park for 6 years or so when I was in grad school. And there were some of the runners that I coached, and this is like non-athletes, but would get very discouraged when I would give pacing parameters for their runs, and they weren't able to meet those paces or hit those paces. It would actually be demotivating and confidence eroding, which was absolutely not my intent. And I recognized that for a certain subset of type A New Yorkers, not to overgeneralize again, but felt like they weren't hitting the parameters that I set. So I quickly recognized, wow, this is not really helpful. And they would have a watch that would, guess what, when they look down, remind them repeatedly, yep, not hitting the pacing parameters. Yep, still not doing it. And you can imagine what that would do psychologically and just even your enjoyment of the workout. And so for those athletes, I thought, they still wanted to capture the data, but I put electrical tape over the face of their watch. So we could collect the data, great, but it wasn't in their constant awareness, right? And then switched more to more of a RPE, or rate of perceived exertion, as opposed to more hard and fast numbers from a pacing standpoint. So anyway, there's lots of ways to kind of, go ahead, Melainie, sorry.
Sorry, I was going to say, Riley, I love that. I interrupted you, but I love that whole how to modify it so that it is, it's not, as you said, psychologically damaging or having a negative influence, and depriving them of the enjoyment piece, but also collecting data if that's helpful to you. I absolutely love it. We really struggle with that piece on the data collection, Riley, for our non-serious athletes, if I can use that phrasing, who are more obsessive with their exercise. We actually, sometimes ask them not to take off their watches and such, because sometimes it can be negative. So it's a very individualized approach depending on where that person is actually at in the stage of recovery as well, right? Riley, there's a question that just came in that I'm wondering if it's helpful to take it now.
Sure.
It's from Erin, and she asks, it's about perfectionism and training and the relationship with exercise. So does Dr. Nickols see this relationship, and how does he treat athletes with eating disorders when the athlete sees that they'll lose their edge if they let go? In part, they feel this perfectionism has led to their success, and they feel they always could do a little better or more. How do you handle that scenario?
That's a wonderful question. And yes, kind of a hallmark traits of athletes that are actually like wonderful attributes. We want to kind of celebrate that wiring of someone's disposition. I will actually, I'm going to fast forward just a little bit here real quick, and then I'll go back, because actually, hold on one second. Okay, here it is. I have actually a slide on this. So the perfectionism piece is relevant, and I think there's sometimes like this notion whereby doing more is better. However, I think unintentionally it can kind of fuel this kind of really unwholesome clinging to exercise, to training, to even just in terms of nutritionally too. However, they're oftentimes as a function and byproduct of perfectionism. And many of the individuals that we see with eating disorders kind of are wired with this disposition. There is just an utter inability to be just curious. I don't know about you, Melainie, but I think that I think curiosity is such an admirable human trait and disposition. I love individuals who are just curious and just absorb knowledge and want to learn and grow. And there's like an open-mindedness. So there's eager to know or learn something. just in general, which is celebrated. I do think though, and I was sitting with a rower who I worked with a little while ago, and she really, perfectionism is off the charts for her. And she said something in session that I reiterated back to her. And I think it was about sport, but it was also about her recovery too. And this was the quote she said. She said, "It's easier not to give myself a chance than to try really hard and fail," right? And that just struck me. And I said it back to her. I said, wait a second. So it's easier to not give yourself a chance and try really hard to fail. And she said, yes. And I said, well, what would happen if you gave 100% of your effort, like in your recovery, in your sport? And she said, well, if I fail, then that's just on me, right? And I think with individuals who are, wired with such a perfectionistic disposition, if they, give 100% effort and there is failure, right, it is utterly intolerable. No one likes to fail. No one likes to kind of feel like they're not proficient. But perfectionists, it's like intolerable. And so for her, a way to kind of safeguard and mitigate that was to like dial back the effort just a touch. And so psychologically, she could kind of, I think when things didn't go well or there's struggle, she could say, well, I didn't really, I didn't give 100% of my effort. So I just thought that was interesting. And I do think too, like in terms of kind of the question there, Melainie, that just clinically, this really is complex and interfolded into one's struggles with their eating disorder, with their treatment, and in terms too with sport also. So I think an inherent kind of byproduct of perfectionism is kind of just an inability to kind of rest in one's strengths or attributes. I think there's it's oftentimes, I think, fear driven, and I'll talk about that in a second, but not inability to kind of rest in that and those strengths. So I'm hardworking, I'm dedicated, I'm motivated, but it's challenging to kind of rest in that. And of course, acknowledging efforts, celebrating accomplishments is essentially non-existent, right? And so oftentimes there's this, like, there is no endpoint. The goalposts are moved oftentimes in one's life, if that's academically, if that's athletically, and it oftentimes is fear driven. And I've got a slide on that coming up here, but there's just an utter lack of self-compassion. So I think clinically trying to cultivate a greater, more self-compassion for all of our clients, of course, but especially with individuals who struggle with perfectionism too. I'm going to go back, if it's okay here, to with perfectionism and training. I do think, like, where's the data, right? Okay. So the data is here. We collected data for a few years with our athletes coming in, published this a few years ago, and essentially, like, there oftentimes is this fear for athletes of my performance is going to deteriorate if I make these changes that you're asking me to in terms of my recovery. Really quickly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we captured strength and power data, vertical jump, grip strength, VO2 max or submax, and push-ups upon admission. And I say admission lightly because it is actually not right at admission. It is when our doctors clear patients for walking, dance, and yoga. And sometimes that takes a hot second, right? So actually, the admission data is actually, it would be more profound, and there'd be more profound differences if we did actually capture it at admission. But to be safe, we couldn't just admit someone to residential care and do a VO2 max or submax test. That it wouldn't be appropriate. So upon admission, we captured this data every 30 days throughout, and then again at discharge. And what we found was interesting. What we know as providers, but what objectively shows too, not surprisingly, significant changes BMI, admission, discharge. Grip strength was significantly changed from admission to discharge, improving. Push-ups improved by about 30%, which is striking. That's a power measure, even despite kind of an increased body weight for these athletes. Vertical jump remained about the same, but I still think that's remarkable given that the BMI changed as much as it did. Keep in mind, our average length of stay is roughly 70 days. In a very short period of time, athletes are training a lot less in volume. Sometimes not training at all for a sustained period of time, eating differently, changes in body weight, changes in body composition. Most any athlete would say, yeah, my performance is going to tank, right? and we see just in a very limited period of time, these objective measures actually improved. So the fear there is obviously kind of supported by data, as opposed to us as providers just saying, hey, trust us, right? This too, I think athletes, this was a runner in our care a while back. Again, I'm cautious to kind of give these and try and make it seem as overly simple and as linear as this, but this was her on the left before she admitted to treatment. She was 90 pounds, clearly malnourished, underweight, in the depths of her eating disorder. She ran 2 miles in 10:54, which in my opinion is still a really good time. Went to treatment, got to her goal weight, was I think right around 110 there. And as you can see, I mean, pictures speak 1,000 words. On her left, her form was really suffering. This was the end of her race. And I recall that she said she passed out shortly after crossing the finish line, really just deprived of energy. Just looks a lot more strong there, and not surprisingly, time improved too. And that's not our goal. Our goal is not, let's get you performing better. Our goal holistically is let's foster and facilitate needed healing and repair in your brain and body. And my belief is for athletes, you give yourself the best opportunity to perform at a high level, consistently optimize your abilities and talents when your body is at a place of energy balance and is nourished, right? For athletes, you do kind of got to weave in the performance piece. I don't mean to say that this is a success story that we see with every athlete that we see, but this is one I think that's helpful. One of the quick things that I will say before moving on, going back to the injury piece, I think clinically and as a treatment team, this is a really vital part to athletes thinking about their eating disorder as a metabolic injury. I do think there is a needed time to grieve the temporary and sometimes permanent loss of sport. Sometimes that's glossed over from a treatment, like let's get to work, let's kind of make some changes and fix things. The psychology of injury research is profound in terms of supporting just the grieving process, similar to losing a lost loved one, that athletes, and you need to allow space for that. I think it can feel dismissive and disconnected too when that's limited. Of course, limited interaction with teammates is challenging for a lot of athletes, and not being at practices as regularly too. And that needs to be addressed, and trying to find a way to stay connected. Some athletes need to actually distance themselves from their team because they actually see that, Instagram postings and pictures of team practices and games is not helpful and just a reminder that they're not there. So you really kind of have to take an individualized approach to that. I conceptualize eating disorders as almost like the tendonitis of physical injuries. And for those of you who've had tendonitis, it is a nagging, annoying injury that you have to give attention to and some TLC, or else it'll reemerge. A big piece too about uncertainty about regaining performance. This is for most all injured athletes. So this is just to normalize that. Very normal for all injured athletes. For athletes in eating disorder treatment, this is even, I think, more pronounced. And so just allowing that space also for that, and just being sensitive, of course. Most of you are familiar with Cook's article.
Sorry, Riley, sorry, a couple of questions there. Sorry, I cut you off there. A couple of questions relevant to what you just were discussing. One is from Stefan, and the question is, I have an eating disorder client who claims to be stronger when she fasts. My fear is that were I to test that objectively, she would tank her physical test when eating to prove her point. How do you avoid such a situation?
Like I guess just to follow up, just to clarify, stronger as in what way? Like stronger physically? I feel stronger psychologically, like because I guess I would want to clarify how she would define stronger to fasting.
Great question. So Stefan, if you could pop that in there. And then the next question is from Delaney. How do you determine if a patient is appropriate to participate in dance, yoga, etc.? Is it when they're medically stable from the MD perspective, or are there other criteria?
I think the medical stability is foundational, but I also think there is like that clinical piece too, right? And so I think I always think like extending kind of movement privileges kind of very gradually. For example, if you're working with a dancer or someone like that, the first activity you would not have them do is go back into like a dance, right? Like I think you kind of think about like a hierarchy, like a fear food hierarchy nutritionally. Same thing. You know, if you work in residential treatment, we do daily walks, 30 minutes, and it seems very, it's just a walk. For some patients, it's actually really hard to modulate pace and intensity, right? Just on a very leisurely walk. So I think trying to kind of integrate movement in a way that is thoughtful, slow, gradual is needed and supported, but also too, there is the medical piece, but also the psychological readiness. So examining motivations for why returning to movement. I know that's a very short answer, but for the sake of time, I think that would be my response to that.
Right. And the addendum to the prior question from Stefan about the client who says that they're stronger if they fast is they feel physically stronger when they fast.
Yeah. I mean, that's there's no science to support that. If that was the case, our Olympic athletes would be fasting endlessly before the Olympics, right? And we've all seen, Michael Phelps, how much he eats, and it's documented, and blows people's minds. But there's just is no. If that were the case, I always go to the top level athletes, and again, you got to be careful about this because there's some outliers. But oftentimes these principles are not supported in science, and I would say, fast, your glycogen stores are going to be just depleted quickly, right? So it just depends on what she's doing. If she's doing maybe a half-hour workout, you're not going to notice massive performance maybe drops, but you extend out the duration, and it's just a matter of time before glycogen stores are totally depleted, and those implications from a strength, power, endurance standpoints are prominent. I think that conveniently upholds and kind of rationalizes obviously her restriction, but there just is no science to support that, in my opinion.
Great. Thanks, Riley.
Sure. Do you want me to keep launching, or is there anything, any other?
Please continue. Doing a great job.
Okay. I know I'm rambling here. So I think with athletes too, I know this slide kind of, I think is important. There's give or take about 40 factors that have been shown to directly influence sport performance. I also want to back up and say that I think it's a mistake to imply or overgeneralize that all athletes or most athletes who are struggling with disordered eating or eating disorders are strictly doing so to improve performance. I just think that's just actually not true. That's maybe initially what I thought was the case, the driving force. I think for some athletes that can be the case, right? But we have to remember this is a really pervasive, severe psychiatric illness that oftentimes does not make sense. And so I say this because I don't think it's just in the pursuit of improving athletic performance. Most of the time, athletes' performances are deteriorating and their eating disorder is really intensifying, and it doesn't really deter them, right? So with that caveat and framing, hopefully, this slide appropriately, when you are speaking performance to an athlete, and sometimes I'll do some preventative, proactive talks to coaches and athletic staffs too. But I do think there's 40 physiological, psychological factors throughout the decades of research shown to directly influence sport performance. As you can see, weight is there. I believe body composition is there too. It's one of about 40, right? I think unfortunately for certain sports, that weight piece can really be elevated to a disproportionate place, unfairly so, while neglecting the other 38, 39 other factors too, right? That any athlete will tell you is really important to sport performance, but it's elevated as being the linchpin to unlock greater performance or improved performance. And I just think for these athletes that we're speaking to, just increases so much vulnerability to give, pun intended, weightiness to the weight factor and variable too. But I do think this is helpful. It kind of frames it. We do a lot of, as a sports psychologist, I work with athletes all the time on psychological skills and trying to bolster and build those at any stage, injury or not. But I do think when an athlete is injured, it is a time to really bolster and improve their psychological skills, which oftentimes are neglected for most athletes in lieu of more of the physical training too. Of course, relationship to self needs to be targeted and repaired. I think that goes without saying. I'll skip past I'm almost done here, Melainie, so we can wrap in just a second. I'd love to hear others' thoughts. The fear piece, in my opinion, I think are driving most eating disorders. Oftentimes athletes I work with wouldn't describe themselves as fearful individuals. However, I think oftentimes things are filtered and they don't land as fear, because fear would be ego dystonic, right? I think fear is the genesis of a lot of things and then driving force. So oftentimes I find for athletes, whether that's, unwholesome behaviors with training, with eating, of course, oftentimes it's fear, but it kind of is filtered as, well, I'm dedicated, I'm motivated, I'm health conscious, sport's important to me. And so therefore it like supports and justifies kind of behaviors, right? But really it's fear. And so I think it's important clinically to name that fear, to try to identify and unpack where that fear might be present on a macro level, but on a micro level too, on a day-to-day level too, and push into that fear. Not just within their eating disorder, but also too fear of like, you know, returning to sport, what that might be like from a performance lens, from an identity lens. So I just think fear is a really driving force here too. Speaking of identity, I do think just clinically with athletes, I think given, unfortunately, our society really glorifies athletes, I think, unfairly at times. And I think sometimes because athletes do spend an exorbitant amount of time, effort, and energy with their sport and have for most of their lives, they can over-identify with that athlete identity. I think there's nothing inherently wrong with an athlete identity, but I think when there's an over-identification, that can be problematic. As we know, with eating disorders, that can sometimes consume an individual as well, even if they would rather it not, that eating disorder identity. So a value, worth, and deservedness is derived from, you know, being proficient in sport, upholding a certain time. And there's this notion where my value and worth is derived more from what I can do and produce as opposed to just who I am too. So I think part of treatment is trying to expand sense of self, right? And help expand that identity piece too. I envision it kind of just simplistically as you know, when you over-identify with anything in life, if that's sport, if that's a relationship, if that's your job, if that's your eating disorder, you literally are kind of floating through life with holding one balloon. And as we all know, for any of us who have lived any amount of years on this earth, unfortunately, at times, that balloon is popped. And if you're holding on to that one balloon, it's going to be a wicked, ugly fall to the ground. And so, at the expense of trying to kind of oversimplify this notion, I conceptualize kind of treatment as trying to kind of develop more balloons in oneself. And so kind of expanding one's identity beyond that of an athlete identity, of course. And I think this kind of rolls into like mind's eye. And I think of like one's mind's eye as being able to hold in your mind, in your mind's eye, parts of yourself, your identity, attributes, and values. And I think for athletes, this is really challenging because when there is a temporary break from sport or modification to sport participation because of complications with an eating disorder, oftentimes I hear athletes say, I just don't feel like an athlete. I'm not engaged in my sport. I'm not practicing. I haven't competed since, 6 months ago or last year. But I also think like, I think of myself and I am a son, even though my mom and dad are not in the room sitting next to me. I can hold that in my mind's eye, and most of our athletes can as well. But oftentimes with this athletic identity, it's almost like because I'm not doing that in the moment or not competing, then I'm less of an athlete, right? And I think we want to kind of foster and preserve that and really develop an individual's kind of mind's eye and cultivate that throughout treatment. Lastly here, I will speak really briefly to just the confidence piece. As we know, athletes' confidence is vital. I oftentimes think that athletes struggling in these areas, it's a very humbling experience to struggle with seemingly, quote unquote, like very basic ways of feeding oneself, caring for oneself, and struggling with eating disorders. And that's, I have such compassion for this population for those reasons. But there's oftentimes an erosion of confidence. As we athletes are keenly aware, need to build and generate confidence and cultivate that just because it has implications in sport. So I think trying to build that. We also have some athletes too, over the course of treatment, they may be overly confident, false sense of confidence, right? Overestimate readiness to step down levels of care, reintegrate training, return to school, and are pumping the gas endlessly, and you're kind of trying to pump the brakes. I'm going to skip this for the sake of time here, and kind of end on the this notion that athletes are keenly aware of the demands physically and psychologically of their sport. I believe the military has kind of somewhat coined this phrase, "embrace the suck." This resonates for athletes. They're quite resilient in many ways in the context of sport. I like to take a strengths-based approach in my work with athletes, and my approach and trying to recognize strengths inherently, psychologically, cognitively, physically in the context of their sport, and really try and bridge that to eating disorder treatment. Because those same skills are absolutely vital and needed to do some really hard stuff that we're asking them to do. And for lack of a better word, they need to embrace the suck. Some of our athletes that really have an inability to connect with distressing, intolerable emotions avoid the suck, right? They push it aside and avoid it. I think any athlete, I was talking to a swimmer, high-level swimmer, Olympic caliber, yesterday, and she was saying, when I'm doing, I think it was the 200 butterfly, I know that the last 100 are going to be really painful, and so I prepare myself for that. And I said, wow, isn't that wonderful? So when you get to that place, it's not a surprise at that place in the race, right? She goes, yeah, I know it's there. I've experienced that a lot, so I kind of expect it. And so I think similarly, when we're asking our athletes to do some hard things nutritionally, exercise, otherwise, almost to like expect it and to embrace it. And you can embrace something that is uncomfortable, that you wish were not there, but that I think positions things a little bit differently. And I think that can be language that, athletes resonates with just in the context of their sport. I will say, I do think there's significant risk, and we are privileged to work with the clients that we do, but there's just a tremendous responsibility that we have to obviously uphold their care in totality. And I think there's a tremendous risk of mismanaging unintentionally so an athlete's care, especially reintegrating back into training and sport. And just recognizing that, looping in providers, if that's not your expertise, that's okay. But there are people out there who can provide guidance. I can certainly pass along some recommendations of my own also. And be the squeaky wheel. I advocate this just endlessly. I don't care what your role is in providing care. I'll gladly disagree with doctors and cardiologists and give rationale. I would love to roll up the sleeves and go toe to toe. But I advocate for you to do the same, because I do think that your voice is so valuable. Your clinical intuition, your judgment, and your expertise is needed. We absolutely need these squeaky wheels on these interdisciplinary treatment teams to be squeaky. I can't tell you the number of athletes that we've had that should have been in a higher level of care for a long time. And there was one provider that kind of just kept saying, we can't do this anymore. At the time, they're not thankful, but I think after some time getting the care and healing that they need, they're really grateful. This is my contact information. You're welcome to reach out. My Victory contact information. I also have an outpatient practice too, where I do consultation formally or informally, treatment teams, athletic departments, and I'm part of PsychPack. So my license is recognized and able to do telehealth in about 16 states now too. With that, Melainie, I'll throw it back to you. If there are any additional questions.
Riley, that was fantastic. I was busy taking notes here and such. We've got some questions here, which I certainly would love to go through with you, but I just a couple of things that stood out for me. One is around on many things, but one in particular was the identity piece and the one single balloon, and the idea of what we're really looking for our clients is to have a whole bundle of balloons, a whole bundle of different aspects of our identity, not just one thing. I thought that was a very, very clever analogy and a visual, to really think about with our clients. I also love what you just said there, Riley, about, the attributes of our athletes is, they know in training and in performing, competing, embrace the suck. And we can agree to disagree on that terminology, but anyway, it is what it is. But I thought that was so great, because if we can frame recovery and the nutritional piece and the psych piece and the medical piece around that idea of, just like when you're competing and you get to that point, that pain point, this is something similar, and we know that you have the fortitude and the resilience to push through that, so just some really nice framing there from you, Riley, which was just terrific.
Thanks,
I learned so much. Riley, we've got a few questions here, if that feels okay to you.
Sure.
And for everyone who's listening, if you'd like to add some more, please do so. So the first one here is for Athenia, I believe. It's around glomerular filtration rate. I'm mispronouncing that, but around kidney function, basically. So The question is, I had a patient with declining GFR and stage 3 chronic kidney disease. She was exercising 20 to 30 hours a week, not fueling enough, and had a family history of chronic kidney disease. Would the excessive exercise and lack of fuel further contribute to her decline in kidney function?
Ooh, yeah. So I say this with the caveat that I'm not a medical doctor. So I'm careful to kind of definitively and unilaterally, but I would be hard pressed to think how it could not. I mean, absolutely. I think that would just expedite the declining kidney functioning when you're not adequately hydrating, and your hydrating, needs are so high with such output. Also, I mean, I think absolutely, and that's a really scary, dangerous situation on many levels.
Exactly. Okay. A next question from Margot. Can you talk a little bit about specific issues around aesthetics in dance, gymnastics, any kind of, anything where there's that aesthetic component to it?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, and really just a challenging aspect of these sports that we're not going to change anytime soon. This is just a reality of demands and expectations, right? Where the aesthetic and kind of your body is judged and evaluated on just how it looks and moves, right? So this is really challenging. And there are some wonderful kind of dance companies, of course, and gymnastics coaches out there. So I'll say that with that caveat. There's some that get it, they're sensitive. There's also we've had several artistic directors from dance companies, while one of their dancers is in intensive treatment, ask the client, the patient, the dancer, to send her or him a current headshot or current full body picture, because they're concerned that with the weight restoration, they're not going to look the part. And it's so sad. But this is the conflict that is just reality, right? And so I think I try to explain that, like, there are sport body stereotypes. There are absolutely dancer body stereotypes and gymnastics that are just inherently maybe even conducive to the sport, right? And that is just real. Some individuals organically, genetically fit into that stereotypical body, right? Yes. And some do not. And I think and their bodies just need to look and be different, right? In terms of weight, shape, size. The challenge then becomes, it's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, right? When you genetically just need to be at a certain place physiologically, weight-wise, otherwise, and the demands of your sport, like say otherwise, right? And you take measures to kind of, shift to that place, it really just increases the vulnerabilities exponentially. So you can't serve two masters, right? You can't uphold and respect your genetic makeup while also trying to meet the demands of your sport. Sometimes there's overlap and it makes total sense and it's good. And sometimes it's just a mismatch for what is required too. So I can speak a lot more on that. That's challenging. And I feel for individuals in those situations,
Yeah, absolutely, Riley. And I think perhaps confounded also with the idea that, I think in society because of diet culture, there is a belief that if you want to change the shape and size of your body, then just go on a diet, and you can do so without any appreciation, obviously, for genetics and optimal physiological weight, etc. So that and because of the misinformation out there, Riley, and I'm sure you see this all the time, as do we, the misinformation, even in the healthcare field, around this very component of optimal weight and genetics and biology. I think that there's a lot of confusion out there, and there's a lot of people who are trying to fit their body shape, their genetic body shape, into some kind of shape and size that is not best for that sport. For example, someone who's short, maybe basketball is not the best sport for them, and no matter how hard you try, that genetic piece of height is possibly a limitation. I don't know if that sounds accurate, but okay, that's awesome. Let's have a look here.
One more thing I will add to that really briefly, Melainie, is that I also think too that in like gymnastics and dance, strength and power are vital components to those sports. And I think you can be, I guess I don't mean to oversimplify this, but I think it is possible to be an aesthetic sport while not focusing on changing your body aesthetically. Like, I know that seems, but I think you can be in an aesthetic sport while focusing on those other multitude of things to kind of increase your training preparedness from athletic performance, right? But if the target is changing your body aesthetically, that doesn't always align and support the demands of your sport. But I think that you get in that trap where I'm in an aesthetic sport, therefore I need to change weight, shape, size, right? Which oftentimes too poses not just vulnerabilities from, psychologically, but also too from strength and power, which is really vital in those, in gymnastics and dance. So.
Absolutely. I so agree with you. And actually that example that you gave earlier of the runner who was, at 90 pounds and then through recovery went to 110 pounds and her pace increased significantly increased from 2 minutes 54 to 2 minutes 30 or something.
Right.
That's extraordinary and really speaks to that strength piece. Riley, another question as we're talking about this is, you have your finger on the pulse as far as the coaching world out there, the sporting world out there. What are you seeing at the conferences? What is the conversation around disordered eating and eating disorders in that field, and what coaches should be doing or not doing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there has been in the last year more public stances that athletes have shared about their experiences. I think like Mary Kane is the one that kind of comes to mind. I got a lot of press about kind of the culture that was like normalized at the high level. And some other athletes too. Alexi Pappas struggles with depression and whatnot too. But I do think that those more public athletes who have come forward and said, this is just not right, and I'm going to speak out about this, and these things impacted me. I do think rightly so has gotten the attention of governing bodies. So I do think that governing bodies, I know the USOC, the Olympic Committee, has hired a colleague and friend of mine, Jessica Bartley, to oversee kind of the mental health aspect of kind of providing care comprehensively and adequately to their athletes. And this is a new position. They've got funding for multiple mental health providers, which is awesome. And I think steps in the right way, but I do think it's kind of a top-down approach. And I think the coaching staff, the coaches, I think too, are being more educated and just more knowledgeable that like issues with eating concerns are not going anywhere, and they are present even if you are not aware that they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I'm sure you get a lot of horror stories of really bad messaging that our athletes and even our not our professional athletes, but our amateur athletes, where this is a very important part of their life, they're also really struggling with misinformation and
right
techniques of how to manage and control your weight and such that have led to disordered eating or eating disorders.
Yeah.
So profound. Riley, some great information there, and I'll just let our participants know. A number of you have asked if you will be able to receive the presentation today, and absolutely, we'll be sending a link with a full recording and of course Riley's wonderful slides along with that for you to be able to go through at your leisure. Riley has very kindly put a lot of article sources on his slides as well, so you can definitely check those out and look those up for further information. And then there's another question here that just came in, Riley, for you. We've got about 5 minutes, so we're doing well here. What skills or interventions do you use for athletes needing to take a break from sport? Like, for example, journal prompt ideas, or what do you do there specifically?
Yeah, so just so I understand, Melainie, what do I do to facilitate that, to encourage it, to help them process needing to take a break from sport?
So it says, do you use for athletes needing to take a break from sport? So skills and interventions. So our participant who wrote that, if you wanted to expand on that, that would be helpful. I guess, what is the conversation and what do you give the athlete to do instead?
Yeah, so I think it's important too, and I think well-meaning, well-intentioned providers can sometimes, like, how it hears to the athlete is, hey, why don't you, I don't know, journal about like your feelings, and athletes like, yeah, that's not going to do anything for that. That doesn't even compare to like being in my sport, and so I think framing it as, look, I am not trying to replace your sport. That is not possible. I know this is really important to you. You have longstanding. We're not trying to replace it, right? But we are trying to kind of, I go back, kind of connect it to the identity, sense of self. We're trying to expand kind of your ability to utilize time in other ways, a multitude of ways. If that's socially, right? Like be more intentional. You have more time to potentially connect with others that maybe these relationships were not as possible to cultivate and build. But I do think it's wildly frustrating for athletes when like you're trying to build skills in general, and really they're wildly disappointed, frustrated when it doesn't work, right? And you're like, well, what does work for you? Well, like when I run, I feel great, and like I feel like my mood's lifted, and then I did this, fill in the blank, right? And it really didn't do much. It didn't work. And so we really have to kind of deconstruct, like, what are the expectations for this intervention? And really, if it is like, wow, I recognize when I get really anxious and it passes a certain threshold internally, that I'm more apt to do something impulsive, reactive, destructive, right? And so the goal of intervening and doing anything to kind of self-soothe and regulate is to kind of obviously decrease the intensity of that distressing emotion, so that I am at a place where it is still present, but just dials it down a touch, right? And so I think it just framing it in that capacity is needed. But when athletes have the expectation from themselves or perceived from providers that it should replicate what they get from their sport or exercise, like that usually is really troublesome and frustrating. Yeah.
That's a great point. That's a great point, Riley, because really the goal of interventions and coping skills, etc., is just to be able to dial it down a little bit, so you create a little bit of buffer so that you don't have to use the behaviors, right? You can,
right.
You can tolerate, as opposed to when you're here and you've got no buffer left, and so you go into your behaviors. So it really that, and managing that expectation, or at least educating around that. That's what we're shooting for. We're not shooting for a zero, right? And that you're going to make people feel terrific by doing this other coping mechanism, lighting a candle, listening to music, or whatever. I'm saying that I don't mean to minimize those different.
No,
things.
yeah, no, they're helpful, but I think along those lines, Melainie, I'll just follow up and say one thing. I do think, like, in order to intervene, you need to have awareness and responsiveness, and timely responsiveness. And I think athletes are keenly aware of this when they're trying to change a technique and skill. So like I was talking to a swimmer, and like I said, it's pretty clear to you in terms of, like, if you're working on your kick and trying to change that technique, you need to have awareness of what you're doing. And that can be feedback from a coach, that can be video. But if you don't have awareness, you're not going to be able to kind of respond in a timely way. And that makes total sense to athletes. And I think similarly with, like, just in terms of regulating emotions and stuff too, we need to simultaneously build awareness, like what's going on emotionally, what's the intensity, and respond in an attuned manner that is timely, right? And kind of linking it to sport, I think, can be helpful. But that's an ongoing objective. That is not a simple, straightforward process. But it kind of made me think of that after your comment.
Absolutely. I love it. I think you really hit it on the head there, Riley. Riley, we're coming up to the end of our time. So I'd like to, if I may, just kind of wrap it up by saying a thank you to you today, Dr. Riley Nickols, for everyone who's joined us today. What a wonderful presentation. I know that we've all learned a lot today. And we want to thank you all for taking the time. And I hope that this presentation, this webinar, has been helpful in giving us more tools and more understanding about what's going on for our athletes, but also that exercise and activity and recovery from an eating disorder are not mutually exclusive. But just like anything, the activity piece has to be really, has to have a lot of oversight, especially initially. There could be some, compulsivity, perfectionism, etc., that could be going on there, that driving our client to really not take the break that they need to recover. So Dr. Riley Nickols, thank you as always, Riley, for joining us today, and for everyone as well, thank you so much. And we will be sending out a link with today's webinar to everyone who joined us. Thank you so much again. Bye for now.
Thank you, Melainie. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much.